Could be said that with the exception of the modern state of Israel, there's never been a time in Israel outside the reign of Herod the Great where the building projects, the architectural work was on such a grand, magnificent scale. I think I'd given you the quote of Augustus before. Whenever I came to Rome, it greeted me and I it as a city built of sun-dried bricks. And when I left it clothed with marble. A lot could be said along the line of that concerning Herod the Great and his building projects in Palestine. His sons, at least some of his sons, let's say, picked up the same trait, but none of them to the degree of Herod. Probably the last thing we'll really be getting to will be the city of Jerusalem and the temple itself. And what we're going to be looking at will just be a brief pictorial presentation of this, because we could go into a lot of the archaeological aspect of this, which is outside the confines of this class. But the Jerusalem that Jesus knew, the Jerusalem that he would have seen as a boy, the Jerusalem in which he would have ministered during his earthly ministry, the Jerusalem that played hostess to the day of Pentecost, the Jerusalem that was known by the apostles, was the Jerusalem primarily that was built by Herod the Great. Of course, it had the initial outline of the old so-called city of David, and that was referred to then as the lower city. I'll show you that later. That was the lower city. The upper city was Mount Zion, and then to the north of both of those aspects of the city was the Temple Mount that was greatly expanded by Herod the Great. We'll get to that here in a moment, though. So I want to just give you a representative overview of some of his outstanding architectural work. Primarily, we'll look just at the more important items, about a dozen or so items more important than the others that were done and built during Herod's life. One note before we get going, much of this was simply refortification. For instance, whenever we say he built the city of Samaria, well, you're familiar with the city of Samaria from being in existence from times way back early in the Old Testament. So we couldn't mean built it in the absolute sense that he was the original founder. I say built, and you know in your mind we're already talking about a city that was in existence, then you have to interpret that or reinterpret that as refortification. He refortifies the city. Now, I don't know exactly how you're supposed to put a slideshow on an audio cassette. But we're going to try to do that. You say, well, it doesn't affect me because I'm here. Well, if you pull this tape out 5 years from now and listen to it, it will affect you then as well. You obviously will not remember all of the exact angles of some of these pictures at which we will be looking. However, for those that do hear it on tape, whether it's others or whether it's yourself at a later time, the only thing I can recommend is to go to some book on archaeology, geography, pictures of biblical history of the biblical land. Find on a certain page a certain city or shrine or area that we have reference to here in this presentation. Acclimate yourself to directions north, south, east, and west, and I think you'll be able to pick up kind of what we're saying here. I've spent a lot of time studying the geography and archaeology of Israel, and in some other areas like in Asia Minor, but I would say more of Israel than any other place because that's where so much of the Bible is situated. That's the scene upon which it unfolds. And I don't know, I don't want to breeze through all of this too quickly because I think you can find it'll be true with a lot of people that they have a difficult time locating directions. And you start saying, now, this is one slide, and this is going to be an overview. And then we're looking at it from an eastern angle here. Notice everything in the picture. Now, the next slide is going to be from a northwestern view. And so then you know you've got to turn everything around in your mind and look at it from the other direction. Some of you probably are capable of that. Some of you, I don't know whether or not you're capable of doing that. But you'll just have to make do the best that you can. Let's have a picture of Israel. Let's have, we've got Sidon up here, Tyre, Ptolemaeus. This prominence here, of course, is Mount Carmel. Caesarea. Joppa. Way up here, we're going to have a little area, Panion. It's where the now Caesarea Philippi is. I'm just drawing a map of Palestine here. Dead Sea, Jerusalem, Sea of Galilee, so forth. Let's start looking at this. We mentioned some cities maybe that are not so significant before we go back to some that are significant here. Let's go back to some that are not so significant but that were still built by Herod the Great. First of all, a city that was between Jerusalem and Caesarea, let's say right around here, that was on the road between Jerusalem and Caesarea. The first century A.D. there was an important well-traveled road between Jerusalem and Caesarea, simply because Caesarea was the capital of this whole area as far as the Romans were concerned. And we'll have a lot to show you and to say about Caesarea. Caesarea on the Mediterranean here, not Caesarea Philippi, which is up north of the Sea of Galilee. Simply because Caesarea was the headquarters for the prefect or for the procuratorship in Palestine. And therefore, the Roman leader here would always be making trips back and forth between Jerusalem and Caesarea. And this city here, Antipatris, these are not that important as far as the New Testament was concerned, although it does appear. Antipatris, Herod obviously built and named after his father, named particularly in honor of his father. So you see we're talking about a city northeast of Joppa, southeast of Caesarea, northwest of Jerusalem, that's on the road between Jerusalem and Caesarea. If you'll open your Bible over to Acts chapter 23, the city is mentioned here. This was a city that was completely built by Herod the Great. Acts chapter 23 and verse 31. Paul has been captured in Jerusalem because of the riot, and the leader of the Roman force at Jerusalem has desired to send Paul up to the prefect or procurator in Caesarea. This is after the discovery by an in-law of Paul's of the plot to take his life. And so we've got all of these soldiers in verse 23 that are made ready to go. In verse 26, Claudius Lysias sends a letter to Felix. Verse 31, then the soldiers, as it was commanded them, verse 30 is the end of the letter, farewell. Acts 23:31. Then the soldiers, as it was commanded them, took Paul and brought him by night to Antipatris. They go from Jerusalem by night up here to Antipatris. Next verse, on the morrow, they left the horsemen to go with them and return to the, should read, fortress, who, when they came to Caesarea and delivered the epistle to the governor, presented Paul also before him. So we have some of them returning back to the fortress of Antonia, at which we'll look momentarily, and some of them taking Paul all the way to Caesarea, where, of course, he's more or less held under house arrest for a period of 2 years. There's Antipatris. Here's old Jericho down here. This is Jericho, not built by Herod. But a couple of cities were. One that's maybe a little bit south, Cypros, C-Y-P-R-O-S. A city built near Jericho in honor of his mother. He did lots of building in honor of other people, giving the name of the city or the territory, giving the name from a relative or a friend of his. And a little bit north of this, you have a city named after his brother. Phaselis, a little city a little bit north of Jericho. They don't figure in importantly in the New Testament. Phaselis. And then you have finally Penion, all the way up here to the north of the little lake of Huldah, which is north of the Sea of Galilee, which is north of the Dead Sea. Here he built not a city, but a temple to the Roman emperor. There's a temple for the god Pan, the Greek god Pan, that still exists. The remnants of it are seen here. And it's right underneath this temple. I didn't bring those slides because this temple was really a different temple. I didn't bring all of that. But it's right underneath the temple built to the god Pan up here in Panion or Caesarea Philippi, from which the Jordan River flows and initiates. It comes out of the rock, comes out of the mountain. This temple is situated slightly up on the side of a hill. And there's a gushing spring that comes out underneath that, and it flows into this lake, and it flows into the Sea of Galilee, and it becomes the Jordan River that flows into the Dead Sea. Let's go back then to the ones that are more important then. Samaria. Samaria was rebuilt in its entirety by Herod and was renamed Sebastete, which is the Greek equivalent to the Latin Augustus. So it was a city rebuilt and named after Augustus Caesar, named in honor of him. Therefore, in New Testament times, it's really not referred to as Samaria, Samaria, but it's referred to by its spelling Sebaste, which means Augustus. It's the Greek equivalent for the Latin Augustus. Here we're looking at a picture of the Samarian hills. This is a modern day picture. This is precisely what Israel looks like today. This is the very road that you travel on. This is the road we traveled on. Goes around the mountains on the other side and loops back this direction. This is the very road that you travel on. If Jesus came through Samaria, we know on some occasions he did. This would have been wouldn't have been a blacktop road back then, but it would have been the very road on which he would have traveled, because there's just so many places you can't go. You're not going to cross all these mountains here. You're going to follow the stream of the river or follow the valleys, and you'll go around that territory. If you can bring that in focus better right here in the center. Here we go. We're probably about 10 miles south of Samaria. This is not the city of Samaria. This is just a little local village right now. But to show you what the area looks like around the ancient city of Samaria, we have some ruins that still exist from the time of Herod the Great, but not that many. But here's a picture of what it looks like looking to the north, the very center of Palestine, about 10 miles south of the city of Samaria. The Romans picked up their practice of theaters, amphitheaters, hippodromes. They picked up these ideas from the Greeks. The Greeks were the first ones to bring these things on the scene. This happens to be, of course, an outdoor theater, which was built by the Romans. It's difficult to date this particular theater. This theater is right in ancient Samaria, the old city of Samaria, the Samaria that was built and renamed by Herod the Great. Probably, I would say it dates to a period in history a little bit after the time of Herod the Great. So we don't show you this specifically as something that was done by Herod the Great, but he did things exactly like this in other cities. This is precisely what it would look like. Of course, something like this just is covered up with dust and dirt and debris, and vegetation then begins to grow, and the animals begin to live here, and it's covered up for centuries and centuries. Not until fairly recent times, last century, particularly this century, it's going on right now. There are archaeological digs in Palestine going on all the time, in the summertime anyway. Fairly recent times, we'd have to say, things like this have been uncovered, and fairly recent times for most of these things to be uncovered. You can see how the theater, it's in a half moon shape. Some of them are a complete shape. Some of them are elongated shape, like a hippodrome. And you would have your speeches up here in the front, You'd have your plays up here in the front. I mean, it was an outdoor type of situation, but you'd have plays, your Roman tragedies and your Roman drama and so forth, and the people would seat themselves here. And of course, we get our notion of modern day coliseums and football fields. Football fields more like a hippodrome is what it's really like. And a coliseum is like a Roman coliseum. And we have theaters, or we call them amphitheaters, that are outdoor situations like this. All of this is built upon Rome, which is built upon Greek history. In Samaria, this is the Samaritan Hill here in ancient Samaria. In Samaria, which of course was renamed by this time, Herod built a huge, magnificent temple to the Roman emperor. Much of its footing and foundation has been uncovered, this being part of it, running across the top of the slide here. We can figure out how long it was, how big it was, how vast it was, but the essential part that still remains is just this stairway. This was the stairway that led up to the front entrance of this huge temple. And it's a massive structure here. This is not like, you can walk on these steps, but these are huge steps to lift your feet up and take steps up this. One thing that's a little difficult to do if you've never been to places like this, or we don't have a scale written on here, is to try to figure out always, does a human being only stand this high right here, or does he stand this high or something? So I'll have to kind of explain that as we go along. So Samaria. He had a summer palace here. Probably that's the chief thing you should know about Herod the Great with regard to Samaria. This is where one of many summer palaces was built by Herod the Great. We move to maybe, with the exception of Jerusalem, some of the most outstanding work that was done by Herod the Great. I just have to go through. I've got, maybe 1,000 slides at home of all of this material. And I have to spend hours and hours. I remember I had a teacher whenever I started in college, I was in the classics. I was working on a degree in classics, and I had a professor, I believe her name was Lucy Turnbull, an elderly lady who had never been married before, a spinster, and she was a professor in Greek poetry and Greek classical civilization. And I remember visiting her in her study before, and she just had stacks and stacks of these boxes, these carousels of slides in there that she had gotten from all of her research over in Greece and Asia Minor and over Turkey and over in that area. And it takes quite a lot of time to go through all of this and pull out just what you need, because you don't have it all arranged. You have it arranged in a certain way, but you don't have it arranged as though you're going to show a class on Herodian architecture. It's arranged in another sense. And so you have to pull all that out and make it fit Herodian architecture, and then file it all back in there, and then it's got to fit into another period of history later on. What are we looking at here? We're looking at the Mediterranean Sea. By the way, not all of these pictures are mine. Not all of these slides are. Most of them are. This was a picture of mine. We were down here on the beach. There's an old Crusader aqueduct and Crusader fortress wall that was built a little behind this and a little to the right of this. We're at Caesarea, or really I should say a little bit north of ancient Caesarea. What you saw on the map as Israel went this way would be right about here. We're looking this direction then, out into the vast Mediterranean Sea. Part of ancient Caesarea can be seen down here. Part of some modern work can be seen down here. This is just a general picture. Dirty beaches around there. Tarry stuff everywhere. You don't want to swim. What did he do at Caesarea? He built a whole city there, complete with theaters, with temples, with all types of dwelling places and fortifications. But chiefly, he was known for the harbor excavation work that was done. King Herod the Great excavated a harbor here in Caesarea that still exists to this day, and that just, modern engineers feel that it could not be duplicated, even with the equipment that we have today, to build the type of work that Herod the Great built here. We're just seeing parts of some ancient foundations here. We're getting over into Crusader era. You can tell with this business right here. We're not talking about biblical times. That looks like something, from Arabian lands. We're talking about Crusader times there. We'll see a better picture here of Caesarea and the port here in a moment. What we've got to remember is between, let's say, anywhere south of Mount Carmel. Remember where Mount Carmel was? This little prominence there. Anything south of that, any city south of that have practically zero harbor. North of that, you've got the great cities of Tyre and Zidon. They were great Phoenician seaports. And to be a seaport, to be a city that is to be a seaport right here on the Mediterranean Sea, you have to have a harbor. You have to have a good harbor. Most of the times you find that cities obviously are built in an area where an existing harbor is. You don't go out there and build your own harbor. You know what a harbor is. You can't just have, like we see in this earlier picture here, you can't just have the waves washing in here. I mean, how are you going to dock any ships out here? It has to be dredged, it has to be dug out so big ships can come all the way up to land here. You have to have, as we'll see in a moment, let's say, forget about this over here, you've got to have land that goes out and curves back in with just one little opening, the ships to come in there, and these two little prominences here serve as, breakwaters. They stop the water, they stop the hurricanes, the forces of the winds and so forth on any port, anywhere in the world, from coming into land. Well, it doesn't exist at Caesarea. All of the Caesarean coastline looks basically like this. I think we ate here. It's been turned into a restaurant right now. We're seeing some of the work. All this was built by Herod, though. All this foundation was extended right out into the Mediterranean Sea. And you see the waves that it's capable of. And this was on a pretty day here. So it can just destroy things if they're not built well. Here we go. Here's part of the ancient harbor, Caesarea. You see this piece of land here, and this piece here didn't used to exist. What you have to see in your mind is that this land, the beach goes along here, and then starting over here, they begin building the land up, carry it out, and hook it back around this way. And carry it out and hook it around this way. And it used to come all the way here. All of this foam, white caps here, obviously the water must be hitting rocks underneath that. We're talking about from right here to right here then, all this was a huge sheltered harbor. All of it man-made, all of it built by Herod. Excavating work is going on there right now. You have to be a scuba diver before they'll let you excavate there, but they're doing a lot of work underneath the water here, and they're just astounded at what they're finding. There's a dig going on, if not now, going on over there in Palestine this summer. It's been going on for years here, maritime Caesarea, where scuba divers are doing a lot of checking the facts and recording the statistics underneath the water, these huge, huge stones that they can't exactly figure out. I mean, we're talking about just an old boat. How are you going to put that stone in the boat in the first place and keep the boat from sinking, and to get out there and lift it over the side and put it down 50 feet underneath the water and put it on a certain little ledge so you can form other blocks around that? You don't have scuba diving equipment back then. How are you going to do something like that? Well, they haven't figured out yet how Herod did all of that. That's what they're working on, trying to figure out how this was done. So you know you're coming across Caesarea in the New Testament all the time. And the Caesarea that we're coming across was built by Herod the Great. This is a little bit north of the area at which we just looked, although you've got it in several directions. You don't have just one harbor here. You've got a harbor down here, the one we just looked at. You can almost see another harbor over here where the land is going to go out and hook around. This was our group the last time we were in Israel. Here we're talking about another Roman theater. It's in absolutely perfect condition, and this one was built by Herod the Great. It's still used today since 1961. It was unearthed in 1961. It's used today by the Israelis for the performing art. This is the stage up front. These are the black chairs sitting down here, and this thing seats, I don't know, 30,000 people, I believe. Of course, you can tell, people say, well, now wait a minute, how could something like that have just been discovered? You know, why could, this thing is huge. This thing is huge. It stands up like a 6-story building here. Well, with all of the wind blowing the sand off the beach here, completely covers the thing, grass begins to grow on top of that, it looks like a big hill, a mountain. If grass doesn't grow, it looks like a big sand dune. To be sure, a large one, a 6-story sand dune, but it looks like a sand dune there. All of this was just gently rolling sand dune hills with some grass growing on top of them until they began excavating work in the 1940s, I believe, and this was uncovered in 1961. And it's been used since that time. They have a whole system of lights, modern lighting around the back of it now, where the local Israeli performing arts group does their thing. We've got some other angles of this. We're looking out to the sea. The next shot will be, I'll be standing up on the very tip top, the last tier, looking down this direction. So you can see the other part of the circle here and more of the chairs down there. It's in perfect condition. You remember that earlier theater we looked at was really run down in Samaria. This one in Caesarea, the sand, it's always the sand that keeps things preserved well. The sand in Egypt, the dirt seems to decay and destroy things. The sand just keeps it perfectly preserved. Most of these people, I think, are part of our group. Obviously, you couldn't see me unless you got a backfiring camera. This is Dr. Bass right here. He was my roommate, professor of theology at Bethel Seminary. This older gentleman right here. But it's just amazing. And you see, just like we see in a modern day football arena, a stadium. You go right through here and you've got tunnels underneath there. Concession stands now. Maybe back in those days, old-fashioned Herodian hot dog. Yes.
Is that marble on those seats?
I'm not for sure if that's marble or not. I don't think that's marble there. It's a stone, like a sandstone or something. I don't believe that's marble. We're going to be looking at some things that are marble. Here I'm out on the beach looking back toward it. Here's the modern lighting I talked about around the top of it.
What carries the voices up through the
Ah.
that speaker?
You remember over in Acts 19, there at Ephesus, whenever Paul has disrupted the local silver shrine industry there for making these little gods after Artemis or after Diana. All the people gather there in the space of 2 hours and shout, "Great is Artemis, great is Diana, goddess of the Ephesians." Well, I've been in that theater as well. And that theater is much larger than this theater right here. And it's so remarkable, they were built that way because of the acoustical ability of them. And we even practiced there at Ephesus. How in the world could the town clerk, as we read in the end of Acts 19, and this is what the critical scholars, before the days of archaeology, they'd be writing from over here in Pennsylvania, and they've never been to Palestine. They've never been to Asia Minor before. So they say, we're talking about 30, 40,000 people here shouting. How can one man, without loudspeakers, without a PA system in those days, how could he really be standing, the town clerk down there on the platform here, and everybody up in the theater hear him? That's an impossibility. Not whenever they're built in that way. They're built that way because of the acoustical ability, and it just carries everywhere. And I practice myself because I wanted to make certain I can say that I've done it myself. I said, let me go to the very, very top. This was in Ephesus, to the very, very top, and someone talked down there in a regular tone of voice, and it carries all the way to the very top. Of course, you'd probably have to have your voice raised because there are a lot of people there. But if you can hear someone talking in a regular tone of voice with the stadium empty, well then if they raised their voice and the stadium was full, probably you could hear them as well. So there's no PA system necessary. You just give forth your voice and it carries throughout all the seats. A lot of this there is part of the modern area. A lot of this is Crusader work over here. There's a Crusader fortress built here at Caesarea with the moat for the crocodiles and everything. We had to cross over the moat to get into the fortress. But see, we're removed from this period in history by 1,000 years. Whenever we study all of that, then we'll bring that. This will be another picture at another time before a lot of this material was cleared away. This is before the lighting went up. This isn't my slide. This is an earlier picture. It goes back to right after this thing was unearthed.
Does anybody know how long it took to build it?
Yes, most of these things would take like under 20 years. Something like this is going to be built in conjunction with the work going on in the harbor, in conjunction with the temples being built, in conjunction with the whole city being refortified. For this particular item, maybe we're just talking about a couple of years. For the whole work in Caesarea, a score years, a couple of decades.
What was the economy like at that time, or should we bring this in here now?
You can? What do you mean by that?
As far as jobs and so on, did the people get paid, or was there slave labor that built this?
Some of it, most of it was slave labor that would build something like this. It wasn't always necessarily Jewish slave labor. We'll find out later that most of the Jewish people were free men. They were poor, but most of them were free men. They would bring labor forces from other areas where they had conquered people, such as in North Africa or something. They would bring them in by the boatload, shiploads of them, and they would do the work here. As far as actually hiring, a contractor hiring out to the local people or something, you don't really have a lot of that going on. Not very much at all. The Romans would use other labor, particularly from conquered territories.
It took an enormous amount of food to feed all those people.
Yes, it did.
Obviously.
That would boost the Jewish economy around there. Because the people, of course, were raising their own food. They'd bring it to local markets, and it would have to be picked up by the people. You get a much better picture of everything that you read in the New Testament when you can see pictures of all of it.
Praise God, amen.
Samaria, Caesarea. Let's move on to Herodium now. Obviously, Herodium would have to have been something built by Herod. We're getting on to the fringes now of what's known as the Judean wilderness. The wilderness of Judea. It's referred to in the Old Testament as the wilderness of Judea. The climate changes, and as a result, the topography changes. If I were to draw a little small-scale map up here of Israel, here's Dead Sea, here's Jerusalem, here's Bethlehem, here's Herodium. About 5 miles southeast of Bethlehem. We're seeing it from a very distant view. We're going to see some tremendous pictures of it close up. This mountain right here, which is a huge mountain, one in our backyard, you're familiar with that one, is totally man-made. This was a flat, level piece of ground. From top to bottom, it's man-made. See, that's our problem. Exactly how they did all these things, we don't know. That takes a lot of wheelbarrows of dirt to bring a hill to that height. No dump trucks. I mean, none of these super trucks where like a man is the height of the wheel on the truck. They can carry just a couple of tons worth of dirt and rock. Nothing like that. All carried around in little wheelbarrows, things that were essential to them at that time, and something pretty much like that. All man-made. This is a distant view of it. Here's another view of it. It looks like a volcano from the top. 2,000 years old. As you can tell, the only way you get up this is this road that goes all the way around the circle of it and comes out at the top here. You can't go straight up the side. It's too high and it's too steep. It's obvious that not too many enemies would try to overcome anybody if they're built on a hill like this. We don't have many of the remains left on the top of it all. You can tell it kind of looks like the crater of a volcano there. But there was a huge actual city, temple, and everything built up here at the top. It was another summer palace that belonged to Herod. Herod the Great was a great individual as far as his building projects were concerned. How long this took, we again don't know, but we're talking about in the decades to build up this much dirt and to have everything fortified like it was. There was a mausoleum at the top of it, and whenever Herod died, around 4 BC, this is where he was buried. No, his bones have not been found. Perhaps grave robbers, perhaps surviving relatives of those that did not survive under Herod's rule stole his bones. But we know that he was buried on top of Herodium. Next picture we're going to look at will be one of his built-in swimming pools. They all built their own built-in swimming pools. And they had built-in swimming pools at the foot of the mountain. And they would have to come down. By the way, the reason they had to have something like this, a summer palace here, would be because of the cool breezes you could reach up on top of a mountain here that you wouldn't get down in the valleys. That's why in the wintertime you don't stay up here, because it'd be too cool. In the summertime you go up here and there's always a fresh breeze up there. Here down at the foot, here's the Herodium here, and here's the built-in swimming pool. This was like some type of little, raft or island out in the middle of it. You can see the walls on this side, crumbling more on that side. They don't exist really on this side, but would come across right here. And again, by some method, we don't know exactly how it was kept filled with water. We're talking about a desert area here. But Herod was king of the Jews, and it was kept with water. They did have aqueducts at that time. They did have extensive aqueducts in the area. Perhaps something like that was used to keep this filled with water. Obviously, it was not filled with rainwater. That simply couldn't happen. But here's how, here's how high this thing is. Here's a donkey, by the way. You can kind of gauge the height of the hill by this donkey. He'd just be a little speck over here. This is more like double or triple the size of the place behind our home. And you can see the road that goes up to it. It would wind all the way around the other side to come down. That's one of the greatest architectural feats as far as mountain moving abilities are concerned that was done under Herodian rule. Masada. Masada, of course, was not built by Herod. It's a natural rocky prominence here. But he did have a summer palace on top of this. And much of the work on top of Masada was done by Herod. And of course it was kind of inherited by the Jewish zealots who took over Masada 66 BC and lasted out past the fall of Jerusalem, past AD 70. We draw again a little map up here to show you where Masada would fit. Here's Jerusalem. Here's the Dead Sea. Bethlehem, Herodium, Masada. Masada, you can always remember, is built just across on the other side of the Dead Sea from where this little point comes in, which is this point here. You see how it goes back out again? That's this portion right here. So this portion right here is all of this. Now, this is an older picture. This is not one of mine. One way you can tell that this is older is the fact that I think I described in a recent message not that long ago was the problem of evaporation of the Dead Sea. It's evaporating along with them taking too many chemicals out of it at, well, we think probably too fast of a pace here. And as a result, the Dead Sea is really now the Dead Seas, two of them, because all of this across here is now dry land. I say dry, I mean murky, muddy land. But you'll see here in another picture in a moment that it's quite a bit different, that you've got one part of the Dead Sea up here and another part here. And this little prominence now has worked its way all the way across to be able to touch the other side. One way, if you ever see a picture, whether it's a modern picture or an ancient picture, we're talking like 20 years ago, of the Dead Sea of this area. So we're looking from the northwest then. We're looking from the northwest to the southeast across the top of Masada. Here's the road over here. Can you focus this way over here? Generally the center and over here is not focused at the same time. Here we go. Anyway, here's the road that comes to it. Focus this again for us. On the other side, presently, and back then as well, is the little station from which you initiate your journey to the top of Masada. This is the Roman ramp. You see all of this dirt that's built up here whenever the Romans finally took Masada in 72, around 72, 73 AD. It's impossible to get to the top of Masada. They didn't have cable cars back then, like the ones we went up on. There is the so-called snake path that leads to the top of Masada, but only one or two people abreast can walk up that, and you just would slaughter the Romans if they came to the top. The only way to get up there is to build a ramp that you can move whole armies up and down. And they piled all this dirt up, made their way to the top, and of course when they got there it was mass suicide by the Jewish zealots. But that's to give you some idea of what it looks like from this particular angle. Here we're more or less looking from the west to the east. Here's the same ramp we just were talking about. We were looking from this direction across here. Here are some of the buildings up at the top of Masada. It was all lit up at this time. Here's an excellent, excellent view of the Roman ramp here. This was a nighttime picture. Here's the group down here. All of this is part of Herod's work here. We're at one extreme end of Masada. The top of it really is way up here where most of the buildings are. But you can see these little paths that work their way down here. He had different little temples and palaces built on different levels as you work your way down. Of course, you can still tell from right here that there's no way that anybody can come up the sides of this. The only way down is to go back up and then go down the other side on the snake path. All of that is work that was built by Herod that's been uncovered in recent times. Here's how you get up now. Okay, here's what we were looking at a moment ago. See, here's the Dead Sea, and here it is right here. This is a modern picture. It's all dried up in between there. All dried up in between there. We're still looking in the exact same direction. We're looking from the northwest to the southeast. We were on the other side of Masada up high in a helicopter looking in that direction. Now we're actually standing on top of Masada. Here are big buses. They look like little dots down here. Here's all the tourist buses. Here's a little area, gift store, concession stand, all of this business. And they have a series of 2 cable cars that hold about 30 people, I guess, that run up and down to the top of Masada. You can walk up unless you're with a group with people over the age of 60, and most of them don't want to walk up. So you go the way the majority wants to go, and that's cable car. Some of the uncovered work here on Masada. Whenever we teach this as such then, and we'll have to give you a floor plan of everything here, and all these buildings, all these numbers here mean something. That's beyond our confines right now, though. Let's see. I don't know if you can see this little black line. See how they've drawn this? This black line will show up better, I think, in the next picture. This black line right here. They marked that, the archaeologists marked that. This was the level that was visible whenever they started to work on it. Above the black line was visible. Everything beneath the black line was all covered up. And so it doesn't look like you're coming up on a building, it's just a wall that you have. You have to dig deeper and deeper and deeper and find out exactly what you have. Herod built this building right here. You can read Hebrew. Here's your Hebrew words up here. No passage, it says. In other words, this is the entrance and this is the exit here. Herod built all of this, put all these stones together. His men built all of it. You know what this was? I don't have very many pictures of this. It was a remarkable building. This is on top of Masada. Now, when you get down there around Masada, it's like 90 degrees down there all the time. Very, extremely, extremely hot down there. You're right near the Dead Sea, 1,300 feet below sea level, the lowest place on the face of the globe. You already know that about the Dead Sea. It's incredibly hot there. Why in the world build a palace up on top of Masada with all of the heat that you have there? Well, he built that and so that on top of it, what he ended up with was inside here was a refrigerator. This was a room that was extremely cold, that they knew how to cool the area there. We think we know how they did that, but I'm not going to get into that right now. We'll save that. You can speculate on that. How can you make a refrigerator back in those days? This was a refrigerator. You would come into the refrigerator room. It would have been hot outside. You come in there and you get real cool. You walk through a passage that connects itself with this room over here. This was a sauna. Was a built-in sauna that worked perfectly. You could go back and forth from one room to the other. Cool off as you first of all came in. Go in the sauna. After you're through in the sauna, go back and get your robe and your clothes and everything back on over here in the cool room, and you're ready to go back outside. and the remains of the sauna and how they kept it always steaming hot with steam pouring out of the room, and yet kept this side very, very cold, was just remarkable. That was one of the most interesting things I think we saw on the top of Masada, was a refrigerator next door to a sauna, all built by Herod the Great. Looking down the other side of it, here's part of the snake path. It winds back and forth all the way until you get to the bottom. People have had heart attacks climbing it. That's why they don't recommend that older people go up it. And so if you're part of an older group, you're with older people, you can't go up it then. Most of the time you're free to go up it, but older people have had heart attacks and died trying to climb the hill.
How long a walk is that up there? Do you have any idea?
No idea. As far as the way the crow flies, we're talking about several thousand feet to the top. But that's back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Masada, remember, was where he left his family, protected from the Parthians whenever he went back to Rome, or whenever he went to Rome. You can see why the Parthians never got to them. They besieged the place for a year, and they were able to withstand the forces for a year.
For the continuation of this message, please turn the tape over.
Masada, remember, was where he left his family, protected from the Parthians whenever he went back to Rome, or whenever he went to Rome. You can see why the Parthians never got to them. They besieged the place for a year, and they were able to withstand the forces for a year. See, they had on the top of this, I don't have all pictures by any means. I've got scores of pictures about Masada. They had on the top of that places to keep your food, places to keep it cool, places to keep it dry if it was of that nature, places to keep all of your wine stored, just baths and baths, bathtubs full of wine, places to take baths. You had bathtubs and everything. It's all built in on the top of Masada. And it's all clearly seen and distinguished today.
You have water supply up there?
Plenty of water, and it never rains on top of Masada. They had plenty of water.
Did they know how they got it up there?
They brought it up there. How they brought that much up there, they're not for sure, though.
Wow.
Because whenever they were under siege, like for 6 years, you had to have enough water to last for 6 years.
Wow.
How they did all of that. Of course, if you know anything about survival techniques, you know as long as you got at least a piece of plastic, you can survive on the desert. They could have gotten water that way, but you can't get water, obviously, to bathe like that. You get enough to survive. Let's come to Jerusalem. We'll end with Jerusalem here this morning. We've got a map here entitled Jerusalem from Nehemiah to the Herods. Okay, that's fairly good for what we want to see. This is what eventually we'll just have to totally memorize all of this. See if you can get it a little better. It's always going to focus in the middle and not on the side. Here a little more. No? Okay. It's not going to focus over there right now. You have to go back and forth. Here's what Jerusalem looked like. We're looking obviously straight down on top of it. Here's Herod's palace. We're going to see other pictures of this. I want you to get in your mind acclimated to this, to see what we're talking about. Here's Herod's palace. Here is 3 towers. I think they've got those reversed. Phaziel's tower is right here. Hippica's tower is right there. Mariamne's tower is here. Mistake on there. I never did notice that. Here's the lower city, known as the city of David, or the Ophel in the Old Testament. Here's the upper city. Probably the Hasmonean palace was somewhere around here. Tradition tells us the upper room. They met in the upper room. Perhaps in John Mark, Mary's house right here. Different sites for the crucifixion arranged from over here. You see traditional Golgotha to up here, and the same for the tomb as well. Herod is the one who expanded this western wall all around here. This wall, by the way, does not exist today. That you can drive right along here. You come in the Dung Gate here, Jaffa Gate here, Damascus Gate here, and the Eastern Gate over here. Here is the temple, or we should say, first of all, the Temple Mount that was all built by Herod. Here's the major entrance. You enter the temple from the south. You enter through what was called the triple Hulda gates. There were a double Hulda and triple Hulda gates that were along here. Robinson's Arch is built around here. You've got Wilson's Arch up here. The temple faces to the east. You've got your various courts around here. Gate Beautiful may have been over here. We're not for certain about that. Pinnacle of the temple from which Jesus was tempted may have been right here at this portion. You've got the Pool of Bethesda up here. It's called the Sheep's Pool back then. And you've got the other pool down here. We're not, it must be off the map. This must be Nehemiah's, the red walls must be Nehemiah's time, because you see the city is quite small, has grown a lot. Oh, this is Fortress of Antonia right here. It's at the northwest corner of the temple precincts. We're going to look at all of this closer up here in a moment. So here, obviously, north, south, east, and west.
What's the scale of the city?
What's the scale? I have to look on the thing. Do they have a scale
Yeah, they got one.
on the bottom? Lift that up a little bit then. Focus the bottom for it.
Mm-hmm.
200 meters. 200 meters. What we're talking about for this red line right here. Okay. Oh, lift that up again. You see, here's the Valley of Hinnom. Here's the Kidron Valley over here. Gethsemane right here. Mount of Olives right here. This was a road that would take off and head toward Jaffa and Caesarea. You'd have another road that would take off toward Damascus up north. The modern day picture of Jerusalem. Okay, notice here you have to always focus your attention on the Dome of the Rock. That acclimates you to where you are in Jerusalem. Is always look for the Golden Dome. Of course, you know what that is now. Let's take you back to see what we're going to be talking about. We're looking from this direction right here. We're going to be passing these towers. This is known now as the Citadel of David here, looking across to what was the temple, what is the Dome of the Rock. So this direction here will be here, across this direction. Here are some of these towers that are still left. We'll look at these more closely here in a moment. This is Jaffa Gate. This is the old city of Jerusalem. Now the new city of Jerusalem is built to the west. So this over here where we are is a new city of Jerusalem, where you have all your modern skyscrapers and so forth. All of this in the walls, within the walls, not all of these are Herodian walls. As a matter of fact, practically none of these, except the western or the Wailing Wall, is a Herodian wall, built later by the Crusaders or by the Arab chieftains that took over the city. But all of this part of the so-called wall city is the old city. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre is over here. I don't see it right. Oh, there it is. Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is one of the traditional places for the burial of Christ. Of course, the other one would be the Garden Tomb. Here you've got the Mount of Olives. This is the Mount of Olives. Here's the Church of All Nations right here. This is Gethsemane. The Western Wall, or the Wailing Wall, is right here. Citadel of David. You have to know your gates in Jerusalem, or you get all confused. This is a Jaffa Gate. If it's on the west, just think that Jaffa is west of Jerusalem. It's over on the seacoast. So this is the Jaffa Gate here. And then, of course, the city's divided up into 4 different quarters now. You've got the Jewish quarter, the Arab quarter, the Christian quarter, and so forth.
Is that temple Jewish or a Muslim?
This.
Yeah.
It's a Muslim place, built several centuries after the New Testament.
Is that dome gold or is that just rock there?
It's copper. Yeah. They've just done recent work on that. Somewhere up here in the hill is where modern university of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem is. And that's where BYU, Brigham Young University, is building their new educational center. It wouldn't be here on this. This is an older picture. Another way you can always tell the date of the pictures is look at the cars. See if we're talking about a 40s or a 50s model. That's an old picture. Here's a modern picture. This is a work done by an artist in Israel several years ago to scale the artist's conception of Jerusalem of the time of Jesus and the apostles. A man equals 2 inches. In other words, 2 inches would be about this. Here are the outside city walls right here. This is probably the best thing that exists today to better understand the old city of Jerusalem. Now, a lot of this is hypothetical. We know, obviously, all of the basics of the design is certainly true to life. Most of that is hypothetical as far as, now, does the top of this exactly look just like that? See, we have some of these towers that exist over here. We've got portions of those that exist anyway. Were all the houses, do they look exactly like this? We don't really know that, but that's probably as good as anybody can do. We'll give you the history of this at another time, but a single individual did this and worked years laboring on it. And now you can see what a person looks like. In other words, a person is just a little bit taller probably than, this is Solomon's or Herod's temple here. Probably a little bit taller than the temple. And it's built perfectly to scale here. It's a huge thing. It'll take up your whole backyard, you know. It's a fabulous work. Okay, here would be Jaffa Gate, but of course it wasn't Jaffa Gate back then. That's what we call it today. Here's Jaffa Gate. Here is Herod's palace. All of this. That's why we've got this. This was built by King Herod. This was used by the prefects and procurators whenever they came down to Jerusalem, such as Pontius Pilate. Whenever he came from Caesarea down to Jerusalem and Christ is on trial, this was probably the residence of the procurator or prefect whenever he traveled to Jerusalem. This is a huge palace. You can see the swimming pools or fountains that were built out here by Herod. All that's probably very, very true to life. We've got different towers here. As I think I said on the earlier one, they have these probably mixed up on that earlier chart, I believe. This is the Tower of Phaziel here. This was built by Herod. This was named after his brother, Phaziel. This is the Tower of Mariamne, named after his wife, second wife, third wife. He had another wife named Mariamne. This is Hippocus. This is something we haven't discussed before. We will look at all these 3 towers here in a moment from this angle coming back in this direction. Then we'll look at the bottom part of this tower, which still exists today, the Tower of Phaziel, which still exists there at Jaffa Gate here in a moment. Here I want you to see the fortress of Antonia. There's no doubt about the fact this is true to life. Wherever you read in the KJV, the castle, they took him to the castle. Antonia by name is never mentioned, but they always call it the castle. And it wasn't a castle, but it was a fortress. This was built by Herod. Notice it's right at the northwest corner of the temple precinct. It was built here. The Jewish people were known to be a riotous people. They were zealous after the ways of God and the ways of their law, and there were all types of confusions and problems that would happen here in the precincts of the temple. As a result, Herod wisely built this fortress, and this is where the local Jerusalem garrison of Roman soldiers would be stationed. That way they could quench or quell any rebellion in an instant of time that takes place over here in the precincts of the temple. That's what happens with Paul, remember. The soldiers come running. There's an inside entrance into the temple here, the temple area. The soldiers come running from under Lysias, the chief captain, from the fortress of Antonia down into the precincts of the temple. They snatch Paul away. He talks about going back up the stairs, and he hollers at the people from the stairs. That would be stairs on the inside of the porticos here, of the colonnades, that would go back into the fortress of Antonia. You really have to know all this, or you're just confused about Jerusalem. So we know that Jesus stood around here in this area. We know that he stood here. Here's Robinson's Arch and stairway. Here's Wilson's Arch. Here are the triple holed gates. Here are the double holed gates. This is the chief entrance into the temple. It's from the southern area. Huge stairway. You would go up. And here's the temple mount. This whole area here was built by Herod. All of these walls built by Herod. The only one existing today is this wall right here, a very small portion of this wall, known as the Western Wall, or the Wailing Wall. It's this little section right here that exists. Here is the temple itself. I think we'll see it from this angle, looking from the east to the west, where these people, where this young lady is looking in the green shirt. You find that interesting there? I've got many shots of this from every conceivable direction. I just brought a few to see these towers here, to see Herod's palace, to see Antonia, because these are things Herod built, and we're talking about Herod and his architecture. Here are 3 towers. Here's the Tower of Phaziel, and here's the Tower of Mariamne.
Wow.
Here's the Tower of Hippicus. See this? Part of the Hippodrome. We don't know exactly where the Hippodrome was. It was either up north of the city, or it was part of the lower city. They have it, according to this artist, down part of the lower city. You can check that in the back of your NIV reference Bibles or NIV study Bible and look and see. And I think they've got the Hippodrome way up north of the city there. Some people believe it's down south. These were big, huge towers. Now, a man on this would be about this high, maybe. That's how high it would be. So you can tell we're talking about a 6, 7-story building right here. This still exists today, the bottom portion of it. Right here. Tower of Phaziel, built by Herod the Great, named after his brother. Here's another view of Antonia. Here's the temple, so now we're looking from the north to the south. This is the northwest corner of the temple precinct, and here's where Antonia is built. Again, here's a doorway, and a man's going to be, half of that doorway. So there's a man about right here. 2 inches, what the man would be according to this scale. And inside, of course, he built these 4 towers that were part of the fortress because you have a better point of viewing the city. And the soldiers would be garrisoned inside the fortress here. Here's what would be typical little Jewish houses up in the northeastern part of the city. Now we're where the young girl was in the green dress, from the east looking toward the west. There would have been Herod's temple. We were standing over here. Here's probably parts of some of these towers over there. Herod's palace would have been over there. Antonia is right over here. There's the big, huge double doors that Josephus speaks about that go into the temple itself. All the people, all the men would have gone up through this. You've got the court of the women out here, and then the court of the Gentiles out further. You can see how huge of a complex. Whenever you read in the Bible that Jesus went to the temple, of course it doesn't mean that he went inside. It means that he went to somewhere this huge, many acres this Temple Mount takes up. He was somewhere. He might have been way over here between these 2 columns teaching some people. And so maybe the Pharisees over here hear about him, and then they run over there to him or something. You have to have all that picture in your mind to know how all of this is working itself out in the Gospels. Here's a view from the southwest looking to the northeast. Here's the same Temple Mount. Of course, it's kind of reduced right now. Here's part of how far it should have gone. Somewhere along here, you can see just portions of it now. It would have been Robinson's arch and stairway, and Wilson's would have been somewhere up here. This little tiny area that you can see right here is the so-called Wailing Wall. We'll look at a close-up view of this here in a moment. But this is at the southwest corner to the Temple Mount. It's the only portion of all of these walls that can definitely be dated to Herod's time. These are Herodian blocks here. And we've got some more that are out here, well, really on this wall, all the way down, that are actually part of that. We'll look at here in a moment. Here would have been the stairway that led into the old temple area. The triple hole, the gates, can still be seen, something there. They've been, of course, blocked up. Here's the Church of All Nations over here. This is Gethsemane. The Mount of Olives is right here. Here's the so-called tombs of Absalom, which really was not a tomb of Absalom. They're no doubt Hasmonean mausoleums. This is the modern road that goes around. Of course, the ancient wall of the city came way out here on these earlier maps at which we've looked. All of those walls are gone. This wall is not Herodian. This is a later date. Here's the Dome of the Rock, which is where probably the temple originally stood. Here's the so-called Eastern Gate that has lots of connotations in Judaism, in Messianic Judaism, and so forth. You stop me if you've got a question about something particular. Here, in other words, is the old city of Jerusalem, most of it. We've got more of the old city around this direction. All of New Jerusalem, King David Hotel, and all of these famous places that you've heard of are over here to the west.
When was the walls of the temple destroyed?
The temple destroyed?
Or then one walls that you're pointing to?
Well, it depends on which ones we're talking about, but the temple and much of the destruction was done by the Romans in AD 70. But of course, Jerusalem has gone through so many changes by means of going from one hand to another among the nations that she has suffered incredible damage. It's remarkable that anything still exists there to be seen in Jerusalem. But the Crusader era was a terrible era in Palestinian Jewish history, where you've got the Western nations from Europe coming down and trying to take the city away from the Turks, and then the Turks take it away from them, and then they take it from the Turks, and the Turks take it from them. A whole lot of what we see in Jerusalem now was built either by the Crusaders or built by some of the Arab or the Turkish chieftains. Here is something that may have dated to Herod's time. We're talking about southwest corner of the area now. Here's the Dome of the Rock in the background. Here's one of the other mosques a little bit to the south of the Dome of the Rock. We're going to see, I think, three different views of this. One further away, one closer up, and then one closer up to see the Herodian building blocks. Closer up of this same area. Here's some of the massive work that went into Herod's building project. In other words, stones like this would be almost as long as a man if he were lying down. Would be how huge these are. And the reason why is because this particular area right here, it had to hold so much earth behind it. This was the Temple Mount built up here. It has to hold so much behind it, it has to be incredibly strong. You know, whenever you start piling earth behind a wall, eventually it'll just push that wall right over. So he had to make it out of these incredibly huge blocks, these big square rectangular blocks, in order to be strong enough to hold up the earthwork behind it. This is a controversial. This is part of a convent there in Jerusalem now. It's part of a controversial question. These pavement stones that are mentioned here, the lithostrakos. Over in John's Gospel, John probably is translated in the KJV as the pavement. And it's been supposed for years that this pavement right here was the very pavement that Jesus would have been tried upon, that he would have stood before Pontius Pilate and the Roman soldiers. That's been believed. As a matter of fact, most conservatives still believe that. I don't guess I want to pass judgment on that yet. One problem enters into the picture in that there is a pool underneath this. There's a pool of water. I didn't bring that picture. Underneath this, right underneath this pavement here, a huge pool that you still have access to get down there. Josephus tells us, he's writing the end of the 1st century A.D., Josephus mentions that pool by name. It still has the same name today. And in talking about that pool, he said that pool was open to the sky. So if that pool was open to the sky, it's impossible for this pavement to have been there. Therefore, some of the French archaeologists have come to the position where they do not believe this was the actual pavement. Then we'll have another couple of pictures here of an ancient dice game that was being played upon this pavement by the Roman soldiers. You'd had nothing else to do. When Jesus is in there before the governor being tried, the Roman soldiers are standing outside around the fire, remember? And Peter is out there with them, and that's where Peter denies the Lord. There's nothing to do. It's during the middle of the night. You have no sleep at all. You're going to do something to busy yourself. they scratched little games on the pavement here. Some type of little dice game they were playing, and one of these happens to exist. Here's another view of the same area. It's called the pavement in John's Gospel. Here's the dice game right here. They haven't figured out exactly how you play it. We know that's what they were doing. Why would they just be drawing on the floor, you know? They're playing some game. Here's a close-up view of it. Not much of it's left. You can see whenever we go back to any of these, well, I guess this one, see how smooth this is? Years of horse hooves and wagon wheels and feet walking across this, of course, before this whole modern building is built over it, has worn everything down incredibly smooth. So it's remarkable that we even have this little dice game left. Now we come to what should be probably the very end of the slideshow here. We're looking at the little area out front of the western or the Wailing Wall. So we're looking from the southwest to the northeast, really from the west, basically from the west to the east. Here's where Herod's temple would have been built, probably Zerubbabel's temple built there, probably Solomon's temple built there, probably David offered a sacrifice there on the threshing floor of the Jebusite man there. This is the Herodian wall left. Here are all the people congregating out front. This is where all the young Jewish boys at the age of 13 go through their bar mitzvahs at the Western Wailing Wall on certain mornings of the week, like on a Tuesday morning. They'll go through their bar mitzvahs, local Jewish boys, here at the Western Wailing Wall. Of course, it's probably the stereotyped, most romantic and most famous part of the old city of Jerusalem because of all of the nostalgic history behind it. Just to show you, though, how different the scale is now in comparison to how it was. Can you see this little arch over here? This is the doorway. You can walk underneath that, and it's about maybe the height of the ceiling here. Remember, I walked underneath that. That used to be like 3 stories high. It was an arch, a huge arch like this. And you would have just been a little figure down here walking in the bottom of the arch. And this is the very top of it, all that remains. That means that all of this area right here has been built up several stories with buildings that have been destroyed. And what you do is just lay the blocks down and build a new building right on top of it. And that building destroyed, lay it down, build right on top of it. And you build up and up and up. You can see that a person is just a little dot here compared to this wall. But in other words, what I'm saying is this wall was probably double its height. If you dug down far enough, you'd get down to the very bottom of the wall then. Because this little arch right here, which is about the height of this ceiling, used to be like 3 stories high.
Did they ever do any digging to see what was down there?
No, not there. It's too sacred of an area for the Jews. The way you get into this is through the dung gate, which is right over here. It comes from the south, of course. You're coming from the south in through the so-called dung gate. Called the dung gate because all the rubbish would have been taken out of Jerusalem from a gate on the south because the valley of Hinnom was to the south. So you take it through that gate, and hence the name the dung gate. Here's a close-up view. Well, let's go back and see. I'll be standing like over here right outside this arch looking in this direction down the wall. The arch is behind me here, the doorway. That's where all the sacred scrolls are kept. I don't know if we can see any here. I've got pictures of them. You know, they're things as big as your little boy or girl, this big, in these big containers that these young 13-year-old Jewish boys have to lug out there and be able to read some scripture from it. We call them beanies, these little things you have to put on your head. All of this is Herodian masonry work here. Jews sang their little prayers before the Wailing Wall, and little pieces of paper stuck in there, of course, with their prayers.
Do you have to wear those over there?
Yes, you have to wear that whenever you're in this precinct. For all of we foreigners, they have a little man that stands there and gives you a cardboard one or a paper one to slap on your head. And you pick up that little cardboard beanie and slap it on your head and run in there. Whenever you come out, you drop it back in the box.
That's just a men's one, isn't it?
Yeah, well, women are not allowed here. Good Jewish chauvinism. Notice in the picture here, there's no women at all. Here you can see some women. There is a little retaining wall, comes about this high or so, that runs all the way around this side. We'll see it again from another angle, and across the front of the Wailing Wall here. All women have to stand beyond those bounds. only males. It can be a child, but it has to be a male child. A baby, it has to be a male baby. And come down here into this area. It's very holy as far as the Jews are concerned. But only Jewish men can come and touch the Wailing Wall and pray there.
How long have they been wailing at the wall?
Well, they've only had it back since 1967. So it's really become the Wailing Wall after getting it back in 67. You'll find now, this is a modern picture. I believe this was one taken by myself. I don't see any people I know, but I'm pretty sure I took this picture. You'll find that over here, it's a little too difficult to see. I've done other pictures at home, but you'll find over here, they've got TV cameras set up down there. They actually have TV cameras, and they film the bar mitzvahs of the young Jewish boys there. And the Jewish mothers and the Jewish big sisters and the Jewish aunts and so forth, they stand all back here and they chant hallelujah at a real fast, high-pitched pace as the boy is going through his ceremony. He has to read part of the law, pronounce it all clearly and distinctly, which officially incorporates him into the standing of a Jewish male. You can see this Jewish brother right here reaching up, touching the wall, praying up a storm next to the wall. Here's the old descendants of the Hasidim, all the men dressed in the black garb here of the old Hasidim. Here's a good phylactery. You can't see much of it, but you can see the strap of it around the man's arm. I've got some better pictures, but I don't think I brought them along. They've strapped around their arm and strapped around their forehead a little box sticking out about 2 inches from your head and 2 inches from your left arm. Still won't see any phylacteries, but there are a lot of young Jewish boys at the wall. Here's a picture standing up against the wall, looking out. Here's all the women behind this front barrier. Now, I know this fellow, so I must have taken this picture then. We had an earlier picture whenever they had the Jewish flags up over here, from over here looking toward the Wailing Wall. Now we're right up against the Wailing Wall, looking away from it. Here are all the women. You can see they're propped up on their elbows, just watching. You can tell what time of day it is here. This must be early in the morning, since the sun rises in the east, and this is the western wall. The sun's still on this side, still on the east side of it then. You can always date almost any picture I see. I can date it if I know what the area is because of the way the sun is shining. But the thing to remember about this particular wall, all these blocks are Herodian blocks. Here is one that we give the credit for putting all of this together. Okay. You have to turn that down to let it cool off. Let's sum up Herod's impressively important life here then. He's important in New Testament studies, not because of the couple of times that his name is mentioned, Luke 1, Matthew chapter 2. Not really even because of the slaughter of the innocents in Bethlehem. He's known for the fact that he had a jealous, suspicious nature, but he had an architectural bent. That's not what makes him most important from our point of view. What makes him most important from a New Testament point of view is his role that he plays in the Herodian line of kings. In other words, if we would never have had a Herod the Great, we could never have had Herod's sons. You're already familiar with the fact the Idumeans were forced into Judaism by John Hyrcanus. They clung to Judaism, but they never were really accepted by the Jews for Old Testament reasons, Esau, Book of Genesis reasons. The Herodians as such are mentioned over in Matthew 22 and verse 16. We know from history the kingdom they were trying to set up, the people known as the Herodians. The kingdom they were trying to set up under Rome was actually what brought about the whole downfall, not only of them, but of the nation of Israel in AD 70. We're going to need to finish looking at our chart here in addition this morning, and I think this will probably be the last time we have to look at this. Notice that we are back to the problem of pagans appointing high priests in Israel. Herod is the one who's appointing these high priests without any regard to the dignity or to the sanctity of the office itself. He's the one who's appointing all of these high priests, at least down until the time of his death. Where are the true priests at this time? Where's the true line of priests? These priests that he is appointing are not from the line of Aaron. We discussed this in an interesting message. You don't remember? They're in Egypt. They remain in Egypt for many hundreds of years, until after the fall of the city of Jerusalem. So these are not in the correct line to be high priests anyway. Remember, during Herod's life, as well as some descendants of Herod, in the ministries of John the Baptist, Jesus, and Paul, we see many problems in the marriages of political leaders. Didn't John the Baptist get in a slight bit of trouble for some of his comments about some marriages? Jesus had some comments to make. Paul had some comments to make. Well, again, all of this in the New Testament can be traced back to Herod. Herod himself had 10 wives. So he was the one who really was the initiator of some of these marriage problems that we know cost John the Baptist his life. On the chart, about the only things I've not covered would have been a reference to two of the most famous rabbis of this period of history. They're mentioned here as Hillel and Shammai. You need to be familiar with those names, Hillel and Shammai. They are particularly well known from the question of divorce over in Matthew 19. In Matthew 19, and the whole subject of divorce there can best be interpreted, whatever you understand, that we're talking about two schools of thought that are present at this time. Those who follow Hillel are the more liberal of the disciples. They believe, in other words, you can divorce for many reasons. Remember, the question in Matthew 19 to Jesus was, can we put away our wife for any cause or for every cause? To answer yes would have been to answer according to the precepts of Hillel. Those who followed Shammai were more conservative. They were more strict in their allowances for divorce. That's why we have these two names on your chart then, Hillel and Shammai. The other name that you have that I haven't mentioned is Philo or Philo. These men almost have to be studied on their own, but he was the important Jewish historian, Jewish philosopher, Jewish writer who lived in Alexandria, Egypt, living right up through the life of Christ. Philo or Philo of Alexandria. The other reference that I see is a date 20, a vertical note, rebuilding of the temple begun. It was either in late 20 or early 19. I always go by the date 19, so you may want to change that. Most people, I think, do. But we know it was towards the end of 20 BC or the beginning of 19 BC. I go by 19. The crumbling remains of the temple of Zerubbabel are taken over by Herod. The temple is worked on until around AD 63, a period of 80 plus years. It's finally completed and then destroyed by the Romans 7 years later. They worked long and hard to build this fabulous gold and marble colored thing. In John chapter 2 and verse 20, we're helped out on our chronology of New Testament events by knowing the fact that Herod began the temple in around AD or BC 19, because the Jews said 46 years the Jews have been building the temple, and you said you'll destroy it and build it again in 3 days, 46 years. So you just do some adding and you end up with the date for Jesus' life and ministry. I believe that leaves us then with Herod's death. Reading from Josephus' Antiquities, 17:6-5. End of the 3rd volume, if you have the 4-volume set, Whiston's 4-volume set. 17:6-5. But now Herod's distemper greatly increased upon him after a severe manner, and this by God's judgment upon him for his sins. For a fire glowed in him slowly, which did not so much appear to the touch outwardly, as it augmented his pains inwardly. For it brought upon him a vehement appetite to eating, which he could not avoid to supply with one sort of food or another. His entrails were so ulcerated, and the chief violence of his pain lay on his colon. An aqueous and transparent liquor also settled itself about his feet, and a like matter afflicted him in the bottom of his belly. Nay, farther, his privy member was putrefied and produced worms. When he sat upright, he had a difficulty of breathing, which was very loathsome, on account of the stench of his breath and the quickness of its returns. He had also convulsions in all parts of his body, which increased his strength to an insufferable degree. It was said by those who pretended to divine and who were endowed with wisdom to foretell such things, that God inflicted this punishment on the king on account of his great impiety. We've suggested that before, and it comes from the writings of Josephus, and he says this is what other people are saying. A little description here of Herod's death. Did you catch that earlier sentence? His privy member was putrefied and produced worms. He died a horrible, horrible death. He also sent for physicians and did not refuse to follow what they prescribed for his assistance. Went beyond the river Jordan, bathed himself in warm baths, which besides their other general virtues were also fit to drink. When the physicians once thought fit to have him bathed in a vessel full of oil, it was supposed that he was just dying. But upon the lamentable cries of his domestics he revived. And having no longer the least hopes of recovering, he gave order that every soldier should be paid 50 drachma. He also gave a great deal to their commanders and to his friends, and came again to Jericho, where he grew so choleric that it brought him to do things like a madman. And though he were near his death, he contrived the following wicked designs. He goes on to tell the story I've said before about, well, since no one's going to be weeping at my death, and after I die, kill X number of Jewish leaders, so at least there will be cries in the land. He commanded all the principal men of the entire Jewish nation, wheresoever they lived, to be called before him. Now the king was in a wild rage against them all, the innocent as well as those that had afforded him ground for accusations. And when they were come, he ordered them all to be shut up in the hippodrome. That lets us know historically that the hippodrome did exist in Herod's time, and of course it would have been built by him. He desired, therefore, that as soon as they see he had given up the ghost, they should place soldiers round the hippodrome while they do not know that he is dead, and go on and murder the people. Then you have to go over to 17:8:1. Josephus doesn't have a lot to say about his death per se. He has a lot to say about the suffering that immediately precedes his death. As a matter of fact, all we read here is when he had done these things, he died. The 5th day after he had caused Antipater to be slain, having reigned since he had procured Antigonus to be slain 34 years, but since he had been declared king by the Romans, that would have been back in 40 BC, 37 years. That would bring it down to around 4 to 3 BC, probably 4 BC. A man, he was of great barbarity towards all men equally, a slave to his passions, but above the consideration of what was right. Yet was he favored by fortune as much as any man ever was, for from a private man he became a king. And though he were encompassed with 10,000 dangers, he got clear of them all, and continued his life until a very old age. But then, as to the affairs of his family and children, in which indeed, according to his own opinion, he was also very fortunate because he was able to conquer his enemies, yet, in my opinion, he was herein very unfortunate. And he goes on to explain some more about his children. So I guess we could sum up his life by saying it's remarkable, it's almost miraculous that with all of the plots against him, he seemed to escape all of them. And our most important point in looking at that is the fact that his death, according to the account in Josephus, is a death that's comparable to the death of the king over in Acts chapter 12. We turn over to Acts chapter 12, we'll just briefly look at that. We find here that according to the sacred inspired historian, the death is attributed immediately to the Lord himself, that is through one of his messengers, an angel of God. Acts chapter 12, beginning with verse 22. Herod died a very, very similar death. So whenever man couldn't kill Herod, God simply and certainly could. The people gave a shout saying, "It is the voice of a God and not of a man." And immediately an angel of the Lord smote him, because he gave not God the glory. And he was eaten of worms and gave up the spirit. Eaten of worms. I mean, it was something literal that happened, or he wouldn't have phrased it this way. Herod, in some method or manner or fashion, evidently was eaten of worms as well. He did his best to escape death, but of course you can't escape the hand of God. He killed all those people in his lifetime, all those relatives, his mother-in-law, his own wife, murdered all the innocent children in Bethlehem. And so, as I've said before, I think his death is a death that was very fitting for him. It was great in the sense of his political achievements. He rose from just a private individual, as Josephus said, to a king. Herod the great king of Judea. He was great because of all of the architectural work that he did, but he lacked morals and he lacked ethics.